Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. This time, we're going to be looking at making sense of the Troubles.
Okay.
So this is a fascinating look at the Northern Ireland conflict. It's by David McKittrick and David McVeigh.
Right.
And it was published in 2001. And they really did a great job with this book. I mean, they used a ton of different sources,
Yeah.
Primary sources, academic articles, all sorts of journalistic things. They really tried to, dig into this really complex conflict.
Yeah, it's one of the best books I've read on the subject. And what I really like about it is, they don't just cover like the events themselves. They really kind of get into the background, the underlying tensions, and the political and social sort of forces at play that led to this conflict.
Right. And so, as you were saying, it really digs into the background of it all. It starts all the way back in 1921 with the creation of Northern Ireland under the Government of Ireland Act.
Right.
Now, that was a pretty messy separation.
Right. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't a clean break by any means, and it created a lot of problems right from the start. Northern Ireland, when it was set up, it was essentially designed to ensure a Protestant majority, and that led to a system where the Catholic minority was basically marginalized. They faced discrimination in housing, in employment, even in terms of their political rights.
Yeah. It's really striking when they give some of those statistics and those numbers in the book. Like for years and years, there was barely a single Catholic in, a senior civil service position or anything like that.
And then, of course, you have that famous statement from James Craig, who was the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland at the time. He said that Northern Ireland was a Protestant state for a Protestant people.
Right.
I mean, that kind of sums up the attitude of the time, right?
Right.
And then you have the Orange Order.
Right.
This powerful Protestant fraternal organization that had, very strong links to the Unionist Party. They were a huge part of the fabric of the state.
It really solidified that sense of Protestant dominance.
Oh, absolutely. And so, the options for Catholics within this system were extremely limited. The Nationalist Party wasn't really effective in challenging this, and the IRA at that time was still quite weak. They had these sporadic campaigns, but nothing that really achieved any kind of lasting change.
And it's also kind of interesting how the book points out that even the Republic of Ireland in those early years wasn't really in a position to offer much practical support to the Catholics in Northern Ireland.
That's right. They had their own problems to deal with. They were focused on building their own nation, and yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of help coming from that direction.
And so it just led to this, as the authors describe it, this stultifying continuity. For decades, it was the same Unionist Party holding on to power, resisting any kind of meaningful reform.
Yeah, and prime ministers would come and go, but nothing really changed.
The structure remained the same.
Exactly.
And so you have this backdrop of resentment and frustration that just continued to build over time. And then, in the late 1960s, things start to shift with the emergence of the civil rights movement.
Sure. And this wasn't just some random protest movement. This was being driven by a new generation of Catholics.
Right.
A more educated middle class who were demanding their rights and equality.
Right.
And they were inspired by people like John Hume.
Oh, right.
A future Nobel Peace Prize winner who helped to establish the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, LINERA.
Yeah.
And their demands were, pretty straightforward. One man, one vote, an end to discrimination in housing and employment, and genuine political representation.
They were just asking for, basic rights.
Yeah, they weren't demanding anything radical. They just wanted equality.
Right. And so this put a lot of pressure on the prime minister at the time, Terence O'Neill. He was seen as a reformer, a moderate within the Unionist Party. But the book does a really good job of showing how even his attempts at, kind of cautious change were met with resistance from both sides. The hardline unionists didn't want to give any concessions, and many nationalists felt that he wasn't moving far enough, fast enough.
Yeah. And then things take a turn for the worse in 1969.
Right.
With those clashes in Derry and Belfast.
And those really sort of signaled a descent into a much darker chapter.
Definitely.
This is where the role of the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, becomes particularly significant, and especially that reserve force, the B Specials, who were, largely Protestant and had this reputation for brutality.
Yeah.
And their heavy-handed response to these protests just made things so much worse.
Yeah. And those events in August 1969 I mean, they really were a turning point.
Right.
Because it wasn't just about civil rights anymore. It became about survival, about identity, about this deep-seated mistrust that had been festering for decades.
Hmm.
And this is where you start to see a surge in recruitment for paramilitary groups on both sides.
Yeah. And it's just heartbreaking to see how quickly things can unravel like that.
It is.
And so the early 1970s really become this period of intense violence.
Yeah.
You have the emergence of the Provisional IRA,
Yeah.
which was a more militant faction of the IRA, and you have this fierce backlash from loyalist paramilitary groups.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just this vicious cycle
Yeah.
of attack and retaliation with innocent civilians caught in the crossfire.
It was a terrible time. And I think the book does a really good job of, conveying that sense of fear and chaos.
Yeah. And then in 1971, you have the introduction of internment,
Right.
where they started imprisoning people without trial.
And that just backfired spectacularly.
Yeah.
It was seen as just another example of oppression. It was almost exclusively Catholics who were being interned. And it just further alienated the community and drove more people into the arms of the IRA.
It seemed like whatever they tried just made things worse.
It really did.
And then, of course, came that, horrific event of Bloody Sunday,
Right.
January 30th, 1972,
Yeah.
where British paratroopers fired on unarmed civil rights marches in Derry and killed 14 people.
It was a massacre.
And the book's description of that day is just, it's incredibly powerful and moving.
Yeah.
The way they capture that shock, the grief, and just the outrage that swept through the nationalist community. It's hard to read.
Yeah. And Bloody Sunday really was a turning point.
Absolutely.
It shattered any trust that might have remained in the British government.
Right.
And it led to a massive surge in IRA recruitment.
Yeah.
I mean, the violence in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday was just horrifying. I mean, 1970 was the bloodiest year of the entire conflict.
Right.
Nearly 500 people were killed.
Yeah. And it was clear at that point that the British government had to do something drastic.
Mm-hmm.
So in March of 1972, they imposed direct rule, basically ending 50 years of self-governance in Northern Ireland.
Right.
And they appointed William Whitelaw as the first Secretary of State.
Mm-hmm.
And he was given this, almost impossible task
Right.
of trying to restore some kind of order in this incredibly chaotic and divided society.
Yeah, and Whitelaw realized that, you couldn't just rely on military force to solve this problem.
Right.
He knew that they needed a political solution. He needed to find a way to bridge the gap between these two communities. And so he started exploring this concept of power sharing.
Right.
Which at that time was a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
I mean, it involved bringing unionists and nationalists together to govern jointly.
Right.
I mean, a huge shift in the way things had always been done.
Yeah. And the book does such a great job of setting the stage for this whole power sharing experiment and all the, the complexities that came with it.
Absolutely. And it really did require a huge shift in mindset. It
Mhm.
wasn't just about giving each side some seats in the government. It was about recognizing the legitimacy of both communities
Mm-hmm.
and finding a way for them to coexist and share power.
Right.
Which was, as you can imagine, incredibly difficult in a society as divided as Northern Ireland.
Yeah. And the book really takes us to this pivotal moment in 1973 with the signing of the Sunningdale Agreement,
Right.
which was, on paper at least, it seemed like a real breakthrough.
Yeah, it seemed promising.
They created this power sharing executive.
Mm,
They proposed a Council of Ireland to try to foster cooperation between the North and South.
right.
But as the book really skillfully shows, the reality on the ground was far messier.
Oh, much messier. Yeah, I mean, within unionism itself, you have these deep divisions emerge.
Right.
A lot of the hardliners saw power sharing as a betrayal,
Right.
of a slippery slope towards a united Ireland, which of course they were vehemently opposed to.
And this is where we get to one of the most fascinating and dramatic events in the whole story. The Ulster Workers' Council strike in 1974.
Oh, yeah.
This was not your average strike.
Yeah.
This was a full-blown political crisis.
Absolutely.
That brought Northern Ireland to a standstill.
Yeah. And what's interesting about it is, the Ulster Workers' Council, the UWC, they represented Protestant workers across a whole range of different industries. So they had a lot of power and clout, and they were completely opposed to the Sunningdale Agreement.
Yeah.
And they orchestrated this incredibly well-planned, well-organized strike that targeted these key sectors, like electricity and transportation, which basically brought the whole region to its knees.
Right.
It was chaos.
The book paints this really vivid picture of just the power outages, the
Yeah.
empty shelves in the supermarkets,
Yeah.
just this sense of, fear and uncertainty that really gripped both communities.
Yeah, and even the security forces were kind of in a bind because this was essentially a protest movement coming from their own community,
Right.
and they didn't really know how to respond.
And it seemed like the British government was also caught off guard.
Yeah, I mean, they really underestimated the strength and the determination of the UWC.
And so this power-sharing executive, which was already pretty fragile, just crumbled under that pressure.
Yeah.
Brian Faulkner, who was the prime minister at the time, he was just completely isolated.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't bridge the gap between the two communities, and he couldn't even unite his own government.
And so after just 2 weeks of this, really intense disruption,
Right.
the UWC got what they wanted. The power sharing executive collapsed.
And the Sunningdale Agreement was dead.
It was a huge blow to those who had hoped that, peace and coexistence were finally possible.
Right. And so this was a major setback, right?
Oh, yeah.
And as the book points out, it kind of ushered in this period of renewed violence and uncertainty.
Right, because the IRA, I mean, they saw this as an opportunity. Right.
They stepped up their attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Loyalist paramilitary groups retaliated.
Right.
And it seemed like they were right back where they started.
And the book also talks about how this is where you start to see a real shift in the British government's approach.
Right.
They were frustrated with the failure of Sunningdale.
Mm-hmm.
They were frustrated with this escalating violence.
Yeah.
And so they decided to take a much tougher stance, a more security-focused approach.
Yeah. They basically prioritized defeating the IRA.
Right.
Over trying to find a political solution.
And this was really embodied in Roy Mason, who became the Secretary of State in 1976.
Yeah.
Mason was a tough guy. He's, very much a law and order kind of guy.
Right.
And he believed in showing force, so he ramped up the security operations.
Yeah, more surveillance, more intelligence gathering.
Right.
More raids on suspected IRA hideouts.
And there was also this policy of criminalization.
Yeah.
Which meant that they were going to start treating IRA members as common criminals. Right.
Not as political prisoners.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a deliberate attempt to kind of delegitimize their cause and erode any kind of public support that they might have had.
Right. It was a way of saying that, these are not freedom fighters. They're just thugs and criminals.
The book really gets into the implications of this policy.
Yeah.
And how it really fueled resentment within the Republican community.
Oh, yeah.
And it hardened attitudes, and it probably drove even more young people into the arms of the IRA.
It was a classic case of, a well-intentioned policy that ended up having the opposite effect.
Yeah, unintended consequences.
Exactly.
And so the late 1970s, early 1980s was a really dark period marked by some just horrific attacks.
It was a grim time.
And the book recounts these events in a way that really drives home the human cost of this conflict.
Yeah. And one incident that really stands out is the assassination of Lord Mountbatten.
Oh, right.
In 1979.
Yeah.
Mountbatten, he was a member of the royal family. He was a war hero. Right.
He was a respected figure on both sides of the Irish Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And his assassination by the IRA, in a bomb attack off the coast of Ireland,
right.
It was a huge shock. It sent shockwaves through Britain and Ireland.
Yeah, it was a real reminder of just how ruthless the IRA could be.
Yeah. And it showed that they were willing to strike at the heart of the British establishment.
Yeah. And on the same day,
that's right,
they carried out this devastating ambush in Warren Point.
Yeah.
In County Down.
Killing 18 British soldiers.
Which was the deadliest single attack.
It was.
On the British Army during the Troubles.
A really dark day.
Yeah. And, after these attacks, it became clear that the British government couldn't just rely on military force alone.
Right.
They had to address the underlying issues.
Yeah, the political and social problems that were fueling the IRA's campaign.
And those underlying issues really came to a head in a very dramatic and tragic way with the Republican prisoners' protests.
Yes.
Inside the Maze prison. And the book does a really good job of taking us inside the prison walls.
Yeah.
And showing us what was happening there.
And this was a whole new chapter.
Yeah.
Of the conflict.
It was.
In 1980, the Republican prisoners began protesting the removal of special category status.
Right.
Which had basically been granted to them in the early 70s.
Mm.
And it essentially recognized their claim that they were political prisoners, not common criminals.
Right.
And so they were allowed to wear their own clothes.
Mm-hmm.
They had more freedom to associate with each other.
Right.
They had certain privileges that ordinary prisoners didn't have.
Yeah. And so when the British government started phasing out special category status
Right?
as part of that criminalization policy,
Right.
it was seen as a huge betrayal
Yeah.
by the Republican prisoners.
And so they launched this series of protests,
Right.
beginning with what they called the dirty protest.
Yeah, which was pretty grim.
Right, where they refused to wash.
Mm-hmm.
They smeared their excrement on the walls of their cells.
Right.
It was a pretty desperate attempt
Oh, it was.
to draw attention to their plight.
Yeah, and when that didn't work, they decided to escalate things,
And they began the hunger strike.
which is one of the most powerful and tragic chapters in the whole story.
Yeah. The book really captures the intensity and the just the sheer tragedy of that hunger strike.
It does.
It began in 1980 with 7 Republican prisoners refusing food.
Right.
And they were demanding the restoration of special category status, but it became about more than just prison conditions.
Yeah, it became a symbol
Right.
of resistance, a focal point for the anger and the frustration that was felt by the entire Republican community.
And of course, the hunger strike immediately captured the world's attention. It
Right.
became this massive media event. And one of the key figures in this story is Bobby Sands,
Yeah.
this young IRA volunteer who emerged as the leader of the hunger strikers.
Right. And Sands was an incredible figure.
Yeah.
I mean, he was articulate,
Mm-hmm.
he was charismatic,
Mhm.
and he was incredibly determined.
And while he was on hunger strike, he was actually elected
Yeah.
to the British Parliament as an MP for Fermanagh in South Tyrone.
Which was a huge victory for the Republican movement.
Right. It showed just how much support he had.
It did.
But his victory was very short-lived
Sadly. Yeah.
because Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, she refused to concede to the prisoners' demands.
Yeah.
She insisted that they were criminals, plain and simple,
Right.
and that giving in to them would be, a surrender to terrorism.
And so you had this standoff between, these two incredibly strong-willed figures,
Right.
the hunger strikers who were prepared to die for their cause, and a British government that was, absolutely determined not to give in.
And the book really captures the tension of that moment.
Yeah. It was a very tense time.
The political calculations, the moral dilemmas, the human toll that this whole thing took.
Yeah.
The hunger strike went on for months.
It did.
And each death of a prisoner just further inflamed tensions
Yeah.
and deepened that divide between the two communities.
It was a very dark time.
Bobby Sands died on May 5th, 1981, after 66 days without food.
Mm-hmm.
And his death was followed by 9 more hunger strikers.
And it sparked riots
Yeah.
and protests across Northern Ireland and even beyond.
And so this, tragic event, this hunger strike, it was a turning point, even though it was such a horrific one.
Yeah.
But it really demonstrated the depth of feeling within the Republican community,
Yeah.
the intransigence of both sides,
Mm-hmm.
and just this, really desperate need for a new approach.
Yeah, it was clear that something had to change.
Yeah.
And I think the book does a good job of showing how the hunger strikes really paved the way for the next chapter.
Right.
A period that would see a gradual shift towards dialogue, negotiation, and hopefully eventually a lasting peace. It really did. It seemed like things had reached a breaking point. And, out of that darkness, you start to see these glimmers of hope emerge.
Right.
And one of the most significant developments was the signing of the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985.
Right.
And this was a really groundbreaking moment in Anglo-Irish relations.
Yeah.
Because for the first time, the Republic of Ireland was given a formal role in Northern Ireland's affairs.
And it was huge.
It was. They established this intergovernmental conference, which basically gave Dublin a say in matters relating to security, policing, and political reform in the North.
You can imagine how that went down with Unionists.
Oh, they were furious. I mean, they saw it as a complete betrayal. They felt like the British government was selling them out, that this was a step towards a united Ireland.
Right.
And the book does a great job of capturing that anger and that sense of betrayal. There were massive protests, accusations of a sellout. I mean, it really shook things up.
Right.
But what's remarkable is that, despite that fierce opposition, the agreement held.
Right.
And it really did mark a turning point. I mean, it laid the groundwork for much greater cooperation between London and Dublin.
Right.
And it really paved the way for future peace initiatives.
And so while all of this was happening on the public stage, there were also these really fascinating things going on behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And the book reveals this, it's like almost like a spy thriller.
It is, yeah.
These secret talks between John Hume, the leader of the SDLP,
Right.
and Jerry Adams, the president of Sinn Féin.
Yeah, and this was really risky stuff. I mean, at that time, talking to the leader of a party that was linked to the IRA
Right.
was incredibly controversial.
Mhm.
Hume was risking his reputation. He was facing criticism from all sides.
Right.
But he genuinely believed that that dialogue, even with your enemy, was the only way to break the cycle of violence. He understood that excluding Sinn Féin from the process was just making things worse. And so
Mhm.
these talks went on for years.
Right.
In secret, they were very careful to keep everything under wraps. But in 1993, news of the talks leaked, and it caused a huge political storm.
Right.
But Hume and Adams, they didn't back down. They kept talking, and they laid the groundwork for what would become, one of the most significant moments in the entire story. The IRA ceasefire in 1994.
That was a huge moment.
Yeah.
It wasn't a guarantee of peace, but it was a sign that, maybe things were finally starting to move in the right direction.
It was a glimmer of hope.
Yeah. And so the book takes us through those years that followed.
Right.
It was a real roller coaster.
Right.
There were moments of progress, and then there were setbacks. The negotiations were incredibly complex.
Mm-hmm.
They stumbled over things like decommissioning of weapons and how to establish these new political institutions. But even with all the uncertainty and the challenges, there was a sense that something profound was happening.
Yeah, it really did feel like things were changing.
And it all culminated in 1998 with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement.
Right.
This historic accord that created this new power-sharing government in Northern Ireland. It had provisions for cross-border cooperation, for the protection of human rights. I mean, it was a landmark achievement.
It was, yeah.
It was a testament to the courage and the commitment of all those people who dared to believe that peace was possible.
Yeah. And I think Making Sense of the Troubles is a fantastic book. It doesn't just tell us the story of the conflict. It really helps us to understand the complexities of it, the human cost of it, that long and winding road to peace. It's definitely a must-read for anyone who wants to dig deeper into the history of Northern Ireland.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are interested in learning more, we encourage you to check out the book. We've got an affiliate link in the description where you can purchase Making Sense of the Troubles. It's a really worthwhile investment. I think it can really help us to understand not just the past, but also the future of this region that's still, grappling with the legacy of this conflict.
Yeah.
And I think this deep dive is, just scratched the surface of this really rich and nuanced story.
It's a complex story.
But what I hope we've conveyed is that peace is precious.
It is.
It's fragile.
Mm-hmm.
It requires constant work. It requires dialogue, and it requires a willingness to confront the past and to learn from it. And as we move forward, I think it's important for all of us to keep those lessons in mind.
Yeah.
Not just for Northern Ireland, but for everyone who strives for a more peaceful and just world.
Absolutely.